Good afternoon. My name is Zoe Hutchison. I'm a Senior Policy Officer in the Marine Planning Evidence and Research team. Today I'll be presenting to you on ScotMER reflections and the forward look. In this talk, I'll provide an overview of what ScotMER achieved in 2022, which will include an overview of publications that were made available online. I'll then go on to talk about some of the research projects that we have currently underway, as well as some of those that are under development. I'll then move on to the forward look, which will include research for the upcoming fiscal year of 23-24, as well as some of the activities that we'll take forward. And I'll leave you with a very brief summary. With the potential scale of offshore wind, it was clear that the ScotMER programme was going to have to step up a gear. It's fair to say that the ScotMER programme got a bit of a refresh. We reviewed the governance of the ScotMER programme, which included the ScotMER Coordination Group, which has strategic overview of the programme, as well as our receptor groups, who we collaborate with to identify the evidence needs and also develop ideas as to how to address those needs, and the newly appointed Projects Board, which I'll talk a bit more about shortly. For all 7 receptor groups, they had 2 to 3 meetings throughout the year of 2022. The first meeting was largely focused on identifying the evidence needs, and we updated the evidence maps throughout the year. This work commenced in April and July of 2022, and we're pleased to say that the evidence maps were published this last week on the 26th of January. In addition to that, we were also reviewing our cross-receptor strategy to identify synergies between the different receptor groups and where targeted research could be taken forward to address multiple evidence gaps. The second meeting for the receptor groups largely focused on the development of project ideals, and that took place between August and October. The ideals from each of the receptor groups were presented to the Projects Board. They then reviewed the project ideals and ranked them in order of merit. They provided those recommendations to us at Marine Scotland, and we reviewed them with our partners of the ScotMER programme before moving into the strategic planning phase for project development, and this phase is ongoing at this time. In addition to the aforementioned activities, we also responded to the needs of the receptor groups as they came up. So we developed and hosted 2 special sessions. The first one was focused on physical processes and primary productivity, and this came from the physical processes group, who had identified that primary productivity may be influenced by offshore wind, but in order to fully understand the topic, we felt that they needed additional expertise. So we arranged an interdisciplinary session and invited speakers to talk about primary productivity and fully explore the topic. It was a particularly engaging session, and I believe that we're going to invite additional expertise to the physical processes group so that we can explore that in more detail. The second session was focused on the applications of environmental DNA to the ScotMER evidence needs. This is a topic that had come up across multiple receptor groups, and it was clear that we had lots of questions. So we invited experts that work in this arena to talk about how they had applied eDNA to some of their own scientific questions, and also to explore the merits and pitfalls. Within this session, there were lots and lots of questions that were explored. We got lots of answers, and it certainly gave us lots to think about in terms of what the next steps may be. Throughout 2022, we were also working on making sure the reports were available online. Many of these titles are available via our website. I don't have time to go through all of the publications today, but I did want to highlight 2 of the most recent additions. Those are the 2 at the top. So the first one is the Sectoral Marine Plan Roadmap of Actions, and this is focused on identifying the short, medium and long-term research needs to address the ornithological constraints associated with ScotWind. Some of these projects are now feeding into the iterative plan review for offshore wind. The second project there was focused on the risk of collision and displacement in petrels and shearwaters, and so this review was focused on making sure that the assessments could be better informed. Just to make you aware, we do have some additional publications that should be made available soon in 2023. So in ornithology, we have a project that will be improving the estimation of parameters that are used in the collision risk models. For marine mammals, we have a report on dynamic energy budget models and how they can be integrated into the IP-COD framework. And for those of you that are not so familiar with that acronym, that stands for the Interim Population Consequences of Disturbance Model. And then lastly, is developing essential fish habitat maps for fish and shellfish species in Scotland. And hopefully you caught Anita's talk on that particular project earlier in the symposium. Moving on to research projects which are active at present, we have a range of research across a number of receptors that the ScotMER programme are currently managing. I don't have time to go through all of these titles again, however they are available on our website if you care to look. I did want to highlight some of the newer ones that you may be less familiar with though. So in ornithology, we have a feasibility study to assess options for seabird tagging, and that will help facilitate research supporting the sectoral marine plan. We also have a project on rum Manx shearwaters, where a population model will be developed for assessing offshore wind farm impacts as well as conservation measures. In marine mammals, we have a project looking at energy conversion factors used in pile driving models, as well as a new project looking at how to combine data from different sources, so exploring how to maximise the impact of aerial survey data and passive acoustic data in assessments. And in diagamous fish, we have two additional projects. So the first one is looking at salmon tracking to find out their spatial overlap with offshore wind developments in the Moray Firth, so that's a tagging project. And the other one is an in-depth review of the current knowledge with regard to diagamous fish spatial movements and potential impacts associated with offshore wind, as well as an in-depth review. It will also outline future research that should be implemented to address the highest priority evidence gaps. In addition, we also have 5 projects under development. The first one is looking at the feasibility of strategic ornithology compensatory measures. Another will be considering the benthic monitoring designs and making recommendations on best approaches, and that will also consider interactions of the benthis with higher trophic levels. We also have a forward-looking project considering large-scale physical processes and how best to develop effective baselines. We have a socioeconomic project where we will be exploring the potential socioeconomic impacts of offshore wind, and we hope to award that one in March. Lastly, we have a project that will take a targeted approach to defining electromagnetic fields from subsea cables and explore the best way to understand the potential impacts on fish and benthic species. As well as our ScotMER research, we also have a number of research collaborations with other programmes, some of which you'll have heard about throughout the symposium. So, for example, EcoWind, we heard about the Pelagio project, and OWIC, where you might have heard about the Prepared project. So many other projects will also feed into the ScotMER evidence needs. And additionally, we are also involved in the Offshore Joint Industry Programme, which have a number of projects progressing over the next year or so. And I'd encourage you to have a look at their website for your awareness of what those projects are. So, moving on to our forward look on research for 23-24, our upcoming fiscal year, I wanted to explain a little bit about some of the projects ideas that are currently under consideration. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, the project ideas were developed and then considered by the projects board and then internally by the ScotMER programme partners. We are currently determining the resource and seeking approvals to progress the project ideas into fully scoped projects for the fiscal year that's upcoming. In total, there were 35 project ideas presented to the board, and of those 16 are currently under consideration for progression at this time. In the interest of your time, I will only go through those that are currently under consideration, but I would like you to note that the other 19 projects were considered to have value and that we will keep them in reserve and possibly revisit and consider them at a later date. So as I go through these, please note that they're not presented in order of importance or likelihood of progression. They're just categorised by receptor group and then also numerically numbered as they were presented to the projects board. But I'll go through each receptor group in turn. So for ornithology, you can see that there are 3 project ideas currently under consideration. The first one is looking at displacement of guillemots and razorbills in north-east Scotland development areas. The second project would be focused on understanding the response to avian influenza to improve impact assessments. And the third project presented there would be to focus on developing a better understanding of drivers of foraging to improve apportioning of the impacts to specific seabird colonies. Moving on to marine mammals, there were 2 project ideas that remain under consideration for now. The first one was the Scottish Passive Acoustic Network, and so the idea would be to expand on the current network that's been in place, and also it would provide value for pre and post construction monitoring in relation to porpoise and dolphin distributions. The second project that may be under consideration to develop would include a review of underwater noise abatement practices, as well as reviewing current policy drivers with a view to refreshing best practices. In fish and fisheries, you can see that there were two project ideas that are currently under consideration, and they have remarkably similar titles. So they're both to develop recommendations to design effective monitoring approaches. The first one is focused on commercial fisheries and has a socio-economic element to it. So this is a good example of a cross-receptor project that was developed. And the second one would be a similar approach, but focused on marine fish and shellfish species, so more focused on ecology. There was a lot of interest in the diagenous fish project ideas that were proposed, and there are 4 of the 6 ideas currently under consideration. The first one is a spatio-temporal study of salmon distribution on the east coast in the vicinity of many of the offshore wind developments. The second one would be a feasibility study, and that would be focused on apportioning the east coast salmon migrating salmon back to rivers, and so that would be through the application of biogeochemical markers. The third one would be a follow-on project with of one of the projects that I mentioned earlier, where if salmon are shown to be present in the wind farm areas in the Moray Firth, then the specific potential impacts on migrating juveniles could be studied. And then lastly would be a project to expand the West Coast tracking project, and that would enable us to capture fish movements through the northwest development sites. For the benthic receptor group, there are 3 projects that are still under consideration. And so the first one of those was to look at the potential spread of invasive non-native species due to offshore wind farms. The second one was focused on identifying the locality of Arctica icelandica, which is very difficult to do at the moment. And this would include the application of eDNA methods combined with habitat suitability modelling. And then the last one that's still under consideration would be the feasibility study to explore the use of passive acoustic monitoring data, and that would be to assess assess benthic species presence and distribution in the context of post-construction benthic changes. And lastly, there are 2 projects from socioeconomics that are still under consideration, and so the first one is how offshore renewable energy can contribute to a just transition, and secondly, a project which would identify opportunities for collaboration between developers focusing on the process for the socioeconomic impact assessments. So that concludes the summary of the 16 project ideas that are currently under consideration. As I mentioned earlier, progression to fully scoped projects will be contingent on resource within Marine Scotland and subject to internal approvals, of course. It's worth noting that we will be considering our options for collaborative funding and any ways in which we can maximise the impact of the research taken forward. I did mention earlier, and it's worth noting again, that the other 19 project ideas they were considered to have value as well. We just can't do everything at this time, and so those ideas will be kept in reserve, and we may well consider them in light of any new evidence at a later date wherever possible. In addition to progressing the targeted research to address the evidence needs, there are of course other ScotMER activities that will progress just as they did last year. So this will include reviewing and improving the programme with the coordination group, and our next meeting will be scheduled for the summer. We'd very much like to maintain the enthusiasm of the receptor groups and will maintain frequent meetings. Those meetings will recommence in the spring. With the receptor groups, of course, we'll be updating the evidence maps. Well, we've published the evidence map just last week for all 7 receptor groups. We also have an internal working draft which will be maintained, and the intention will be to either publish them annually or when those updates become substantive. We will also be reviewing and developing project ideas with the receptor group such that they're ready to present to the projects board when they meet at the appropriate time throughout the year. We will also be looking to implement our newly developed cross-receptor strategy. In addition, we will review our current approach to communications. We certainly recognise that it's really important to keep our stakeholders informed. And then lastly, and certainly not least, we'll be looking to strengthen our collaborations both nationally and internationally. This may include ensuring alignment with other programmes and ensuring that we've identified and maximised on strategic collaborations both in terms of research and funding opportunities. The sustainable development of Scotland's renewable energy sector will absolutely play a vital role in enabling our transition to net zero by 2045. ScotWind is expected to be the largest infrastructure project in our offshore marine environment to date. The ScotMER programme will both enable and promote the sustainable development of offshore renewable energy. As far as we are aware, the refresh to the ScotMER programme has been well received by our partners and our stakeholders, and we'd very much like to thank everyone that's been involved in the process, and we look forward to working with you over the course of the next year and beyond to make sure that we reach our goals. So that's it from me. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you in the Q&A session.